Krystal, what are you taking a look at?
Well, guys, as if living through a pandemic was not bad enough with the fear and the mourning and economic loss and the social isolation, on top of all of that, we've also had to suffer through this.
Well, look, I want us to act as a community. I want us to act as a team. When you're fighting a war, you need all hands on deck. I don't want to reject those who still haven't done the right thing. I'll condemn them. I'll shame them. I'll blame them. But I don't want to exclude them. They've got to come around. We can't win this war. We're going to be talking about COVID this time next year if we don't get more people to do the right thing. So we can't write them off. We can penalize them more. We can say, you're going to pay more on your hospital bill if you weren't vaccinated. You can't get life insurance or disability insurance at affordable rates if you aren't vaccinated.
So if they get up and criticize science, nobody's going to know what they're talking about. But if they get up and really aim their bullets at Tony Fauci, well, people could recognize there's a person there, so it's easy to criticize. But they're really criticizing science because I represent science. That's dangerous.
First and foremost, I am obviously unvaccinated. You follow the story of me trying to get a COVID test in Aspen, and I only had to get a COVID test to show that it was negative because I was unvaccinated. So I didn't go through those jumps and hoops pretending to be vaccinated. I am not getting this vaccine ever. Never going to get it. I don't care if I'm on my deathbed and they say it can save you. I'm not going to get it. I'm principally now opposed to it, and I do not understand why anybody who is healthy, able-bodied, and young would ever get this vaccine if you're not at risk of COVID.
I am so done with it. They are ruining our country. These vaccine Nazis, and I'm sorry, I know I'm using the word Nazi, and everybody gets mad when I say it, but that's exactly what they are. They're vaccine Nazis, and they need to.
Coach, you think this shows the fascism of the elites?
They are the fascists.
The COVID culture wars. You know, in some parts of the world, COVID actually brought populations together. In Denmark, for example, 72% of people said that COVID actually united them. In Canada, at least before the trucker protests, 66% said the same. Now, there might have been some point in our history when it would have done the same here, but that point in history is not today. In this nation, we fought over literally every aspect of the pandemic and its response. From how it even began, to how deadly it was, to how to treat it. We fought over masking, we fought over pool parties, over school openings, over school masking, whether ivermectin was only for livestock, vaccine passports, vaccine mandates, and of course the vaccines themselves. Signs proclaiming their faith in Dr. Fauci and in science itself sprouted in liberal lawns. As we speak, there are some number of truckers and their supporters camped out in Maryland to protest COVID policies. But a potential sign of the times, that trucker convoy has kind of seemed to lose the thread. One of the leaders told news outlets that in addition to COVID mandates, he was protesting issues as wide-ranging as illegal immigration, foreign oil, trucking regulation, and critical race theory. He also said the protest was to demand justice for Ashley Babbitt, the Stop the Steal rioter who was killed by Capitol Police on January 6th. It says something that the most committed of COVID culture warriors isn't even sure that they've got that much to fight about on the pandemic front anymore. Could it possibly be that the COVID culture wars are finally ending? These media-fueled fights have literally torn families apart, divided communities, and created world historic amounts of cringe content. Could we be moving on from this hellish phase of discourse and mania, the real end of a terrible era? After all, almost all pandemic restrictions have actually now ended, even in the bluest of cities. LA, DC, New York, they've all lifted their mask mandates. The CDC says indoor masking is not really necessary. Schools are broadly open. And Let's Go Brandon Man himself had this to say during the State of the Union.
We have the tools we need. It's time for America to get back to work and fill our great downtowns again with people. People working from home can feel safe and begin to return to their offices. We're doing that here in the federal government. The vast majority of federal workers will once again work in person. Our schools are open. Let's keep it that way. Our kids need to be in school.
This was incredibly significant. Biden is the leader of the Democratic Party, and he used his State of the Union to officially declare an end to the COVID culture wars. Biden saying we've got to keep schools and businesses open means that this is now the officially sanctioned polite society position. Reactionary liberals can't scream that you're trying to murder children or whatever when your position is literally the same as Joe Biden's. And there's another factor as well. Last year in Biden's first address to a joint session of Congress, COVID dominated the speech and dominated the political landscape. In last week's State of the Union, it was Putin's war in Ukraine that dominated the speech, the coverage, and the reaction. There's nothing like war, actual war, and potential nuclear annihilation to focus the mind. Squabbles over masking policy, they kind of seem like small potatoes when put up against the history-bending geopolitical turning point that we are all currently contemplating. Back over in the trucker chat, the war in Ukraine led to infighting as protesters debated whether they should somehow link their own cause in with the overseas conflict. Vice reports the Truckers for Freedom protest Telegram channel, which has 96,000 subscribers, saw some vigorous discussions on how exactly to make people care about their scattershot amorphous cause when the possibility of World War III was sucking up all the oxygen. One wrote, quote, "Truckers at this point can't compete with the world events, and if the movement won't transform and adapt, we won't have the impact that we want." The organizer of that Telegram channel even pathetically insisted that their protest of driving around in trucks and RVs was just as brave as the Ukrainians, who were literally getting shelled and being starved by an invading army. Quote, "What we see in Ukraine is not bravery, it's adrenaline and rush. Real bravery comes from a good dose of wisdom. The people fighting in wars are not brave, but pumped with adrenaline and lacking wisdom. This is bravery, support the truckers." In the most telling sign, though, cable news seems to have moved on. As I write this, CNN's homepage of literally hundreds of stories has one post on COVID, and it's about how the numbers are getting better. The situation, it's similar over on MSNBC's homepage, where the only COVID-related item is about Ron DeSantis's unhinged outburst about high school students wearing masks. On Fox News, COVID updates are buried all the way towards the bottom of the homepage. You have to scroll a long way to get there. And news items include updates on how 90% of the country is now officially maskless and the latest blue cities that are lifting mandates. I might add that Fox News is not featuring a single article about that trucker convoy, at least when I was taking a look at it yesterday. All of this suggests that COVID culture wars have lost their juice as cable news outrage generators. And then there's one final factor, which is the reality of the pandemic today. Cases, hospitalizations, ICU visits, and deaths, they are all declining significantly as the Omicron wave subsides. These numbers should be improved even more by the arrival of spring in much of the U.S. At the same time, vaccination rates are actually quite good. 81% of those aged 5 and up have had at least one dose at this point. 95% of those 65 and up. Deaths, of course, are still unacceptably high at about 1,500 per day. But those who are dying, they're overwhelmingly unvaccinated, and that creates a much different moral landscape than when there were no vaccines. It begs the obvious question, why should we take steps to protect a population that isn't doing the basics to protect themselves? Now, big word of caution here, this entire picture could be turned completely upside down by another variant, and with so much of the developing world still unvaccinated, that possibility is much too likely. That's why I've always said that the one COVID fight that would make the biggest difference is over pharma greed and patent protections. But with COVID declining at home, Democrats even embracing an end to restrictions, and the horror of war being the focus of our minds, it could just be that the fights over maskless Karens and triple masking libs might be coming to a close. And while I'm glad to see the end of this discourse, I can hardly call it a silver lining. After all, what has replaced this culture war are calls for literal war. So what do you think, Sagar? Think we're at the end of the COVID culture wars?
As the Arabs say.
Hey guys, thanks so much for watching.
That's right. Just as a reminder, you can become a premium subscriber today. Watch the full show completely uncut, our reactions to each other's monologues. You get to listen to it. You get to ask us questions, all that good stuff. Link is right there in the description or at breakingpoints.com.
Best of all, great way to say screw you to the mainstream media.